As the mist rises over a darkened landscape, the outline of a figure materializes. A vampire, iconic, chilling, and immortal, emerges from the shadows. Known across continents and ages, vampires have captured the human imagination for thousands of years. This mythical creature holds our deepest fears and our secret desires within it. But where did the vampire legend begin, and why has it endured through the ages? This is the story of vampires, a history woven from blood, fear, and a longing for immortality. The roots of the vampire myth stretch back to the dawn of civilization, in lands where shadowy myths filled the imagination. In ancient Mesopotamia, stories of the Lamashtu demon, a terrifying creature that drank the blood of babies and haunted mothers, struck fear into the hearts of those who heard them. Across the sea, ancient Greeks told of Empusa, a shape-shifting female monster with a single bronze leg, who seduced and devoured young men, and feasted on the blood of the living. These ancient vampire-like beings reflect deep-seated fears of death, darkness, and the unknown. While these creatures didn't match our modern concept of vampires, they planted the first seeds of what would become an enduring legend. But it wasn't only in Mesopotamia or Greece that such stories emerged. In Asia, the vampire myth took many forms, from the Chinese Jiangshi, a creature that drains life energy, to the Indian Vetala, a spirit that haunts graveyards and takes possession of corpses. In every culture, these legends served as explanations for sudden illness, mysterious deaths, and things that went bump in the night. It was in Eastern Europe, however, that the vampire took on the form we recognize today. In rural villages across the Slavic regions, fear of the undead grew as people attributed unexplainable illnesses and deaths to creatures that rose from the grave to prey on the living. These vampires weren't glamorous or romantic. They were the restless dead, feared for their hunger and their power to spread death and disease. Villagers believed that those who died violently or without receiving proper burial rites were at risk of returning as vampires. Families would exhume their loved ones, often to find the corpse looking strangely fresh or bloated. To prevent these suspected vampires from rising, villagers would stake the bodies through the heart or even decapitate them. This was not just folklore, it was daily life. In the shadow of disease, death, and decay, people took drastic measures. If an exhumed body looked unusually preserved, it was seen as proof of vampirism. In the heart of Romania, the legend took a darker turn. In the 15th century lived a prince whose name would forever be associated with vampires, Vlad III, better known as Vlad Dracula or Vlad the Impaler. He was infamous for his cruel punishments, often impaling his enemies on stakes. Vlad's brutality made him a figure of fear, and though he was a real person, his name became forever tied to the vampire legend when, centuries later, it inspired one of literature's most famous characters. Dracula was no myth. He was a real man, a prince of unimaginable cruelty. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the vampire legend took hold in Europe during what became known as the vampire epidemics. In regions like Austria and Serbia, fear of the undead grew so intense that villagers went to authorities, desperate for help. Government and church officials documented multiple cases of suspected vampires, creating a paper trail of belief that would span years. One of the most famous incidents occurred in Serbia with a man named Arnold Paole. Paole had died under mysterious circumstances, and soon after, villagers reported seeing his ghost. They fell ill, and some died shortly after these sightings. Terrified, the villagers exhumed Paole's body. According to records, they found his corpse with blood at his mouth, a telltale sign of a vampire. The villagers took matters into their own hands, driving a stake through his heart and burning his remains. Similar cases of exhumed vampires appeared throughout Europe. Although medical science would later explain many of these phenomena as natural decomposition, these early incidents fueled the legend. The vampire epidemic seemed to have no end in sight. The vampire myth might have remained a dark folk tale if not for the imagination of a man named Bram Stoker. In 1897, he published Dracula, introducing the world to a vampire unlike any before, Count Dracula, a dark aristocratic figure who seduced and preyed on the living. Stoker's Dracula was inspired by old tales from Eastern Europe and the chilling name of Vlad Dracula. But Stoker's creation was more than just a bloodthirsty monster. Count Dracula was intelligent, charismatic, and powerful. With Dracula, Stoker transformed the vampire into a complex character, one that intrigued and terrified readers around the world. When Nosferatu, the first vampire film, was released in 1922, the vampire's cinematic journey began. And with it, the vampire evolved, captivating new audiences in darkened theaters. Now, the vampire wasn't just a creature from the pages of folklore. It was a character to be feared, respected, and in some ways, admired. By the late 20th century, vampires had become symbols of something more than just fear. They reflected our own fears and desires, our love of the mysterious, and our fascination with the darkness within. In the 1976 novel Interview with the Vampire, Anne Rice took vampires in a new direction. Her characters, Louis and Lestat, were sympathetic and complex, struggling with love, regret, and the burdens of immortality. They were no longer mindless monsters, but beings with souls, emotions, and desires. They were tragic anti-heroes, suffering under the weight of their existence. Over the years, vampires continued to evolve in popular culture, appearing in films and television shows like The Lost Boys, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and Twilight. Each new generation reimagined the vampire to reflect their own fears and fantasies. Once seen only as monsters, vampires became powerful, seductive, and sometimes even romantic figures. Today, the legend of the vampire endures, not only in fiction, but in reality. Around the world, there are communities of people who identify as real vampires. Some drink blood consensually, while others draw life energy from the people around them. These vampires aren't supernatural beings, but individuals who connect with the vampire archetype. Meanwhile, scientists and historians have studied the vampire legend to uncover its origins. Medical conditions like porphyria, which causes skin sensitivity to sunlight, or rabies, which induces aggressive behavior, may have contributed to early vampire myths. And many people who experienced vampire attacks at night may have actually suffered from sleep paralysis, a condition that can cause vivid hallucinations. Science may have stripped away much of the mystery surrounding the vampire, but it hasn't lessened the fascination. What is it about the vampire that keeps it alive in our culture? The vampire is a mirror. It reflects the darkest parts of our nature, embodying our deepest fears of death, of disease, and of things we cannot control. But the vampire also fulfills desire, the promise of eternal life, the allure of power, and the romance of darkness. For centuries, the vampire has walked the line between fear and fascination, between predator and lover. And as long as we continue to grapple with these desires and fears, the vampire will continue to haunt us. So when the shadows lengthen and the night grows deep, remember that the vampire is more than just a myth. As long as humanity fears death and craves power, vampires will continue to haunt us. It's a reflection of us, our nightmares and our dreams, our darkness and our light. The vampire is immortal not because it cannot die, but because we, as a culture, refuse to let it go.
Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.